Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are safe and well on this beautiful January day. On behalf of our board chair, Mr. Darren Harmon, and our entire board of directors, thank you and welcome for joining us for the annual Forecast Luncheon. Presented by Medical Associates Clinic and Health Plans, Midwest One, Q Casino, and TH Media. For over 30 years, this chamber time-honored tradition has been one that we all enjoy. In fact, for many, it's the unofficial kickoff to the calendar year. It was just 1 year ago that our presenters shared their forecast for 2020. Who could have predicted, forecasted, imagined that we would be headed into a worldwide global pandemic? In fact, Ben Graham, one of our presenters from last year, in his shame and embarrassment, told me he would be watching from an undisclosed location today. I think that we can give him, as well as all of our 2020 presenters, a well-deserved reprieve after this past year that we've had. 2020 obviously looks different. This event looks different. However, we have a full and robust agenda planned for you today. We've invited 3 economic experts to share their perspective and economic outlook for 2021, and we're really excited to have them today. Before we get started, I would encourage you to use your chat feature for questions. We will take questions after the first speaker and then again at the end after our last speaker. Also, in the interest of time and making sure that we are concluded by 1:30 today, we have the full bios of all our speakers available in the link in the chat feature and also on the chamber website. So we encourage you to check that out. With no further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Chris Kuehl. He's the Managing Director of Armada Corporate Intelligence. Dr. Kuehl.
Well, thank you very much. And as for reporting from an undisclosed location, a lot of us have been trying to do that of late, but you have to understand that economists are famous for predicting the past. We're always running up against something like this. So yeah, it's been an eventful year. We are probably in for another eventful year, but maybe one with a little less drama than the one we just got through. So as we're entering this brave new world, you've all become highly familiar with your virtual mandates. We're now doing Zooms and GoToWebinars, and frankly, people that I've been interacting with look exactly like this bunch. I think I've seen every one of these faces at some point or the other, and with any luck, my cats will not Zoom bomb this one, but I can't promise anything. So I'm going to start off with a few anticipated changes, both positive and negative. And to be honest, whether they're positive or negative depends a lot on the perceiver. It's going to be a matter of how we react to these changes as much as the change themselves. We're in the middle of the vaccine rollout, going relatively okay. We're experiencing about the same thing everybody else is around the world. It's slower than we thought it would be, but it's been slower in Europe, it's been slower in Asia. We're probably, maybe 10, 11 million people into this. The estimation is that we will be close to the maximum for the vulnerable population by March. So people who are especially subject to the disease, people who are elderly, people with underlying conditions. The rest of the population may be by midsummer, but those numbers and those times are highly flexible. You know, it's going to be a matter of how quickly each state can mobilize. And that's been a challenge from the very beginning. Nothing about this has been approached nationally because it really can't be. The various reactions to this have been left to the states because that's their mandate. You know, you cannot close down businesses and require protocols and all that kind of stuff at the federal level. It's just not part of the powers given to the federal. It's state, it's local, and as a result, we're going to have different degrees of exit when it comes to this crisis. We'll see that play out in the months to come. The lockdowns would start to lift probably by second quarter, but again, state by state. Some will lift them a lot faster than others. Some are going to be dealing with large numbers of people in the hospital system, even deep into the spring and summer. So we'll just have to kind of wait to see how that plays out. Iowa is likely to be one of the early requirements as far as getting out of the protocols. The idea is that a lot of the exposure in Iowa is more in the urban areas. The rural areas may be in a position to open up a little faster. We'll see. We're definitely going to see changes in trade relations going forward. They will definitely improve with places like Europe and Japan and Canada. China is not going to see much in the way of change. China has been kind of enemy number one for the Democrats for a long time. They have always objected to the human rights issues, the labor issues, the environmental issues. They don't appreciate the loss of jobs to the Chinese over time. So those who are expecting a big shift in terms of how we deal with China, it won't likely happen under Biden. This is going to continue to be a very intense trade rivalry, and that will have lots of implications for Iowa and for other communities. I mean, our relationship with China is incredibly complex, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We are dealing with permanent changes in the way that people work, and we are dealing with permanent changes in the way people consume. Some of what we used to do will come back, but some of it won't. I mean, for example, people who used to do most of their work in isolation anyway are much better positioned to work from home. I mean, if you used to come to the office and you sat down at your desk and you put your head down and you got work done and you didn't really interact with people much through the day, you can do that from home as easily as you can do it from an office. If your job involved more collaborative activity, if you're in sales, if you need to have more actual contact with people, that will be a sector that will return to the office more aggressively. The rule of thumb right now is that we're probably going into what's called a 3-2-2 system. 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, 2 days at home on the weekends. So we'll see how that plays out, but that's the consensus view. We are doing a lot more purchasing online, big challenge for the retail community as people try to adjust to how much will we return to the brick and mortar, in what respect, what will we continue to buy online, et cetera. There'll be big political shifts. Whether or not this is good or bad will depend a lot on perspective. There's going to be an emphasis on green. Will be great for companies that are trying to be involved with alternative energy and alternative ways of transportation. It will not be so good for sectors that are engaged with fossil fuels. We'll have more stability when it comes to the medical sector. The ACA has been a big point of contention for the last several years, nearly a decade. A little less chance that it's going to disappear at this point. So now the tinkering starts, that when it's more or less safe to start going in and finding parts of it that work and parts of it that don't, there's likely to be an emphasis on infrastructure, which would be a good thing. This is something that, in many respects, Iowa has taken a leading role in. I was talking to a group of economic developers in Iowa probably 2 months ago, talking about the emphasis on broadband access to the internet. And if you want to get the rural areas engaged, they've got to have the broadband access. And that's something that almost every state in the union is experiencing a deficit in. Iowa has taken steps to apply money to this, to include it in the infrastructure plans for the future, and that's generally a good thing. The negative things to look at, kind of the other side of the positives. I mean, the retreating from the pandemic protocols will be slow and there'll be interruptions. I mean, bureaucracy is still an issue. There's popular acceptance to deal with. The mutations are something we're already dealing with, but those could trend in a positive direction too. There was an epidemiological study that came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago that looks at the coronavirus, which is a tremendously common virus. It's the most common virus group in the world. Generally speaking, the coronavirus mutations get progressively less dangerous and less fatal. They are predicting that with the vaccine and all the sort of herd immunity that comes with it, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 version anyway, could end up being a lot like the common cold, that it's something that's in the system, but it's not nearly as threatening as it is right now. That's assuming a lot of things. And this is still brave new world. I mean, if you think economists are trying to hide from what they were saying at the beginning of the year, you should be talking to people in the epidemiological community because almost every week they were making assessments back in April and May, which turned out not to be the case. The business and investment community is going to remain cautious for a while. They're going to want to see what the new administration has in mind. One of the interesting things that may evolve through all this, at least as far as the pundits are concerned, is a lot more emphasis on the center within the Senate, that you now have an evenly split Senate, which puts a lot of power in the hands of those who are the centrists. And there are about 4 or 5 Republicans that tend to lean a little more liberal. And they're going to play a big role. It's going to be people like Mitt Romney and Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski and Ben Sass from the Republican side. On the Democratic side, it's going to be putting a lot of emphasis on people like John Tester and Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And it's going to be very difficult for either party to get anything through without the support of that center group. So we'll see how that plays out. As I mentioned, we'll still have confrontations with China. Consumers are going to have to decide when and if they want to go back to old habits. Polls indicate that we do, but we don't know how fast. We don't know how willing we're going to be to engage in the behaviors that we engaged in before. And then the political issues will continue to linger. What's interesting is that already you're getting a shift in what people are worried about. Even as recently as November and December of last year, going into November, COVID-19 was the #1 concern for the investment community. This is a survey of people who are global fund managers. But by December, all of a sudden, COVID-19 was losing its emphasis as far as being the risk. And out of nowhere comes inflation and fiscal policy, which weren't even on the map in November. So you're beginning to see a kind of a return to we're going to worry about economic issues. We think to a degree that the medical and the pandemic issues are beginning to at least become manageable, that we can see sort of light at the end of the tunnel if things continue to progress the way they are. The best estimates when it comes to vaccine distribution, a little bit all over the place, but most of them are expecting spring, early summer, midsummer, things returning more or less to normal, or at least the possibility of it. We'll talk a little more about that as we go. The world economy is probably going to be spending most of this year trying to catch up from what happened in 2020. So it'll be likely end of this year, beginning of 2022, before you're really back to where we were at the end of 2019 globally. But the investment community is more optimistic. You're seeing more consensus around recovery by mid-year rather than the end of the year. Not a huge difference between economists like with the Congressional Budget Office and the Wall Street Journal's group and all that, but significant. We're talking, a point or two. Do we get back to 5% growth in third quarter, or does it happen in fourth quarter? The investment community is seeing it happen sooner than later. And this is a good sign. There was a lot of fear in the beginning that the investment community would not react positively, and you'd begin to see corrections in the market and all that kind of stuff. That does not at this point seem terribly likely. The OECD, kind of the Rich Nations Club organization for economic cooperation and development, is expecting recovery globally by the end of this year. They're not even pushing it out till 2022. The Midwest in general has been doing better than the country as a whole. The highs were a bit higher, the lows were a bit lower, and the rebound has been quicker. This is a chart that has the same diffusion index that you see with like the Purchasing Managers Index and a bunch of others. Anything over 50 is considered good economic growth. Anything under 50 is considered contraction. So for the Midwest, we've not been in contraction territory that much prior to this recession. Then, of course, we dropped like everybody else did. But by the time you got to mid 2020, we were back into those positive numbers, and right now we're up close to 60. So the recovery has been more rapid, but on the other hand, the difference between the highs and lows have been more pronounced for the Midwest than you would see for the country as a whole. One of the things that also is changing is, again, how the public is responding to things. This is considered pretty typical of the country. This is just for Iowa, where the health issues, about half people are looking at that as the number one concern, but almost the same number of people worried about the economy. That was always the split. We are always trying to deal with two problems at once. If we were completely unconcerned about the economy, we would have just gone into massive lockdowns and have everybody shelter in place permanently. But we never could ignore the economic implications of that. I mean, even with the limited type of lockdowns that we engaged in as compared to some other countries, our economy was faltering, and it was important that we tried to address both at the same time. Just as a contrast with other countries, when France was locking down most aggressively, the rule in France was you were not allowed to leave your apartment for more than an hour a day, and you had to have permission in writing to leave your home for that hour, and you were not allowed to go more than half a mile from your home. So you had, I mean, it was literally like being in prison. You had an exercise hour and you had to do it in the yard. We never got that aggressive when it came to the lockdown. But in the great scheme of things, even that aggressive approach in France didn't really improve their situation when it came to the pandemic. I mean, they still have numbers that are comparable and in some cases higher than ours. I mean, we're dealing with something around 1,100 deaths per million, which is less than what's been dealing with in Spain or Italy or the UK, much higher than some other countries. The winner in all of this, to a degree, has been Taiwan. Their deaths per million is 0.03. They've not had a new domestic case of COVID-19 in almost 9 months. So it helps to be an island and it helps to be small. But the point is that we've always had two issues to deal with simultaneously. One of the things that's been of concern in Iowa and other rural states for a long time is the impact on the rural community, on farming, on farm bankruptcies. And I'm from Kansas, so I'm certainly sympathetic to the same issues that have affected Iowa. The number of Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies have been high in Kansas and Iowa and many of the other agricultural states. COVID-19 has pushed this a little bit more aggressively. Those numbers have gone up even in 2020. And part of the challenge is the impact of the disease itself, but it also has been the impact on trade. And one of the things that we'll be watching really closely in the year to come is whether or not some of these trade relations change. House prices have been relatively under control, but they're starting to show some signs of acceleration. They had been going up, but they were not going up aggressively until relatively recently. I was on a webinar this morning with the Home Builders Association in Kansas City, and the number one concern for home builders right now have been the input costs. Lumber prices have gone into the stratosphere. I mean, they are doubled and tripled what they were even the beginning of 2020. Labor costs are going up. Labor shortages are a huge issue. You are now dealing in Dallas with a year-long wait for a drywall team. There are so few people who know how to put up drywall that you're delaying, I mean, by a year or more or two, building new homes. You're going to have considerable concern within the home building environment as people shift where they live. This has not been a big issue in Iowa. It has been more of an issue, for example, outside Chicago. People are leaving the urban areas and moving to more suburban, exurban, even rural areas just to kind of get the extra room. There's all kinds of things that are driving people to single family homes and larger homes. The two most salient motivators for getting a larger place that are COVID related have been the people working at home. People now need a space. They need the room to designate an office. They're tired of doing this from their kitchen table. They also have children that are learning at home. They need a space too. It's not appropriate to kind of cram them in a corner and hope that they can do their best on their Zoom calls. Remodelers are reporting that those are the biggest drivers for their business right now, is establishing home offices, and the fact that we're just spending more time at home. We may have entertained a lot more outside the home prior to last year, but now we're doing a great deal more inside, and that's all having an impact on the housing sector. You're seeing people take advantage of the work at home atmosphere to move further and further away from congested, expensive locations. I mean, some cities have gone so far as to start paying people to relocate. Tulsa has had a program now for, I think, 2 or 3 years where they're paying people $10,000 if they relocate to Tulsa from somewhere. And they've had hundreds of people that have come from California to work in Tulsa because they do their work remotely anyway, and they start looking at the cost of living, and hey, I can get a whole lot more for my money in Tulsa than I can in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's something that also plays a role as far as Iowa is concerned. Mortgage rates are still going to be low. There are some sort of hints on the horizon that long-term bond rates may start to rise. Nothing dramatic, however. So the mortgage rates are probably not going to stay at the record levels they've been, but they're not going to go back to where they were, even a year ago. So long-term bond rates, yields will continue to stay down. The Fed is not really talking about interest rate hikes at all. They're beginning to at least explain their thinking as far as inflation is concerned, but they're not responding in an urgent manner at this point. The expectations for inflation are low, no matter what you look at. If you're looking at personal consumption expenditure, PCE, this is what the Fed uses to basically gauge inflation. They don't pay as much attention to the consumer price or the producer price index. And the reason for that is that the CPI and the PPI, even though they're more current than PCE, they're a little bit artificial. The way the consumer price index is computed is that we take a basket of goods, the typical basket, quote, that a consumer buys. Well, it's hard to figure out what that is. I mean, a typical basket for a millennial is not the same as a typical basket for a boomer. And so it's which in that is really important. So the consumer price index can sometimes be off. It was going to pick up obvious things like fuel and food and that sort of stuff, but particularly now, a lot of things that we spent our money on, we don't spend money on now. We used to spend 65% of our disposable income on services, which we don't now because those services are not available. The PCE is more accurate, but it is not forward-looking. You have to kind of wait for that expenditure to be made. So it's a little bit slower to come out, but it's more accurate because it reflects what we actually did as opposed to what we might do. We are probably not going to see much in the way of wage inflation. However, we have a real split within the labor force, and this is something we're going to be dealing with for a lot of years, and Iowa has had to face this really for years. Iowa is a manufacturing state. People don't tend to realize that if they live outside Iowa, but those in Iowa know that manufacturing is huge, and it's rivaling the agricultural economy, and in some cases more important. Small business is manufacturing. I mean, 75% of the manufacturers in the United States have less than 25 employees. It is a very small business sector, and that percentage is even higher in Iowa. So you have a lot of manufacturers who are in smaller communities. They're maybe the dominant employer in that smaller community. Their biggest struggle, and it's been their biggest struggle for years, is finding people to work with the appropriate skills. The old days, you could hire somebody on speculation and train them. But that's not really possible now. The sophistication of manufacturing is such that people really need to have those skills in place before they're hired. The people who were laid off this year are not appropriate manufacturing hires. You know, you don't take somebody who worked in a restaurant or worked in a hotel or worked at a theme park or worked in a retail outlet and say, oh, well, sorry you lost your job. How are you at operating a laser cutter? You know, you have much experience with a press brake. How about robot welding arms? Probably didn't come up when you were working as a server. So we still have a major labor shortage, and it's still going to be showing itself with kind of sectoral inflation. For some businesses, it's going to be, wow, there may not be wage inflation generally, but the people who are qualified are asking for a lot of money, and I don't really have a lot of choice but to pay them. We're not going to see much change in oil prices, thank goodness. Well, I guess it depends on your perspective. If you're in North Dakota, you're not happy about this. But the prices are going to be in the 40s and 50s. There's no real driver right now for higher crude oil. OPEC tried to reduce production about 2 or 3 weeks ago, had very little effect on the markets, drove prices up by $4 or $5, and then they came right back down again. We used to be very sensitive to that. We're not now because we produce most of our own oil. Just want to make a quick remark. This is something my company does, the Strategic Intelligence System, and I don't want to go into detail. It's too complicated. It's an eye chart. All I really want to do is point out how green it gets in 2021. We had lots of down quarters in 2021, obviously. Now we're going to see in 2021 much more growth. Not all sectors, aerospace still has some struggles, but generally speaking, for a lot of manufacturing sectors, the next 3 or 4 quarters are going to be pretty solid, which this line also indicates. We're seeing a recovery back to where we were end of 2019, beginning of 2020, and it will probably stay on that path. A little bit of a dip through the course of this year, just as people begin to catch up with their orders and inventories, but then another rise coming towards the end of this year, beginning of next. This is another index that I work on for the National Association for Credit Management, and I only bring this up for a couple reasons. One, credit managers tend to think into the future. These are people who are trade credit. They're deciding whether you're going to get 90 days, 120 days, 180 days to pay. So they're always thinking in the future. When they make a decision, it's based on what they think is going to happen in 3 months, 6 months, whatever. So it is a good forecasting tool. It kind of lets you know where their head is going forward. The other thing to point out is that after all that volatility from March through the summer, things have eased out and we're now seeing more traditional behavior, both with the favorable factors and the unfavorables. The favorables are things like sales and applications for credit and credit extended and dollar collections. The unfavorables, accounts out for collection, disputes, bankruptcies, slow pays. Most of the favorables now are way up into the 50s and 60s. When it comes to the unfavorables, they're recovering. They're still, in some cases, high 40s, a little bit into contraction, but not like they were. And many of them have gotten back up into the 50s. Low 50s, but, 50s nonetheless. Mentioned China earlier, and I just want to throw a couple things in here, not beat this to death, but you see a lot of discussion of China, and it's a little misleading, mostly sins of omission. China is indeed growing. They have indeed recovered more quickly than most other countries in the world. It's why they've recovered that's important. China has dumped so much money into its economy. I mean, we have dumped, what, $4 or $5 trillion? They've dumped 3 times that. They are just flooding their system with money, and they're trying to keep things moving. They want to keep people employed. China doesn't really have a welfare system or an unemployment system the way we do. They tend to use employment for that. So once people have a job, they keep it. There was a story not long ago of a Chinese company that probably had 800 or 900 employees. Everything they produced, they threw away immediately. They produced it, dumped it, produced it, dumped it. I mean, In China, they describe these as zombie companies. They don't serve a function. They're not producing anything that anybody wants, but they do this in construction too. They have built entire cities that nobody lives in because they're just trying to keep the construction jobs going. So there's a very artificial element to China's growth. Their productivity is 30% of ours. It's 30% of Japan's. It is a very unproductive manufacturing environment, which is supported by the state. They can do that more or less indefinitely, but where we worry about our debt right now is probably 110% of our GDP. China's debt is 270% of its GDP. So you think we have problems, theirs is 3 times worse than ours. So just want to throw that in there. So when someone starts extolling the virtues of Chinese growth, you can look at them sideways and say, yeah, not so fast. So end up with this. So we'll have a little bit of time for questions and interaction. This is a classic V. What we're dealing with is an economy that crashed in 2020, came rebounding in 2020. We had record retreat in the second quarter, then record recovery in quarter three. Then it settles down. And what we're going to be looking at through the majority of this year is a slow resumption of the kind of growth we were seeing prior to this. And remember that 2019 was a pretty decent year. I mean, it was not gangbusters. It was not, like setting records growth, but it was good. And it was good coming off a fairly lengthy period of decline. The 2008 recession is still worse than this one. And it was worse because it took so long to recover from. The issue in 2008, we didn't fall as far. We didn't see the decline in GDP that we saw with the 2020 recession, but the bounce back has been swift. If you go back and look at what it took to get out of the 2008 recession, it took years. I mean, technically, we were out of recession in 2009. Did it feel like it in 2010 or 2011 or 2012 or 2013? No, it really didn't. We were still bumping along at very substandard growth. Wasn't really until 2016, 2017, really 2018 before we started to feel a recovery. And that was something that was kind of peaking in 2019. We're on track to get back to that at some point this year. I mean, some of the more optimistic outlooks are saying close to 5% growth, which for the US is really fast. I mean, we're a big, sophisticated economy. Our normal sort of 25-year average for growth is around 2.5. We don't normally get much past that. If we do, we don't do it for long. So we're probably looking at getting into faster than normal growth towards the end of this year, carrying to a certain degree into 2022. One other thing to kind of mention, and that's the whole issue of debt and what it means to be spending all the extra money. We've had stimulus packages. The latest one that's being discussed, at least we're talking about it in a little more accurate terms. We're not calling it stimulus as much as we're calling it a rescue. We have people who lost their jobs. We have people in dire financial straits and need help. Traditionally, a stimulus is something that tries to get the consumer to spend money and tries to basically spend your way out of a recession. We've had a difficult time pulling that off this time because even as we were putting money in the hands of the consumer, we were shutting down their opportunities to spend it. There's a real difference between income levels and what we spend money on. The upper 25% of income earners in the United States spend close to 80% of their disposable income on services. These are people who have all the things they want. They have cars, they have houses, they have boats, they have whatever they want. Now they're spending on what amounts to time. They're spending on people doing things for them. They are spending on going on vacation. They're spending on going to events and going to restaurants and engaging in services. All of that was cut off. So that 25%, that upper 25%, has kind of been sidelined. As they start to find opportunities to come back into the spending circle, there will be a real boost to the economy. When it comes to employment, the people who lost their jobs were in the service sector. Those jobs will come back very quickly once the openings begin, because when you think about it, if you're talking about resuming a manufacturing job or resuming a construction job, there's training involved. You don't just grab somebody and say, congratulations, I've just hired you to help build a house, go frame it. You know, you've been on the job now for 5 minutes, get up there. But you can do that at a restaurant. I mean, you can hire a guy and say, okay, you start in an hour. You know, you're a server. Like when the customer tells you he wants a hamburger, write it down and then give it to the cook, and the cook will give you a hamburger and you give it to the guy that wanted one. It's not rocket science. You can learn it pretty quick. If you get hired to work in a hotel, can you make a bed? Yep. Can you clean a sink? Yep. Great. You start in an hour. Once those things are opened up, the jobs will come very fast. But of course, they have to open up first. We're going to be dealing with a stimulus package, rescue package, probably in the $2 trillion range, which pushes our debt to, as I said, probably 110% of our GDP. Our deficit goes up. The issue is not that we can't do that. We don't really print money, but we borrow it. The Fed basically uses certain banks to buy federal bonds. We offer the bonds to foreign and domestic investors. Right now, about 40% of our debt is owned by the Fed and by the government itself. About 30% is owned by US investors and about 30% by foreign investors. The real issue with debt and deficit is basically the cost of servicing it. We are now spending around $400 billion a year on debt service. This is coming close to the size of the entire US military budget. That's the part that's not sustainable. We can't forever be making debt service the most significant part of the federal budget. Right now, it's number 5. The only thing that's more expensive than debt service, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the military. And then comes debt service. So as we decide what to do with debt and deficit, that's the real issue, is how much do we want to forego? It's opportunity cost. We're spending $400 billion on that. We could be spending it on something else. So as we go forward, we're looking at better numbers for the country. We're looking at better numbers for Iowa. Iowa and often is kind of the litmus test for the world economy because it's everything. It's services, it's manufacturing, it's agriculture, it's medical. There's really no part of the economy that is not represented in Iowa. And that's one of the reasons that it becomes kind of almost a lab. You know, people spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on there. So I'm going to hush now so we have some time for questions. Those of you who we don't get to, or you don't think of your question until later, feel free to send me an email. I am just as long-winded in print as I am in public. We do a lot of writing. I can clog your inbox with no trouble at all. The strategic intelligence system I showed you a little bit of a minute ago. Then we do the Black Owl report, which comes out 3 times a week. And we have the business intelligence brief that comes out 3 times a week. And something I just noticed today, honestly, the acronym for Black Owl Report is BORE. Leave it to an economist to come up with a publication that's called BORE. You know, if anyone wanted to know if we're good at marketing, that should tell you all you need to know. So we're going to hush now, and I'm going to hush now, and you're going to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuehl. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see any in the chat. We'll give it just a second. And as he mentioned, you can email any questions. Also, feel free to contact the chamber and we can get those questions to him as well. Well, with that being said, Dr. Kuehl, I know you've got to go on to another meeting. So thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And I will welcome Molly back to the podium.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Kuehl, thank you so much on behalf of the Dubuque Area Chamber of Commerce. That was a very informative presentation. And our chamber members, if they have questions, we will be sure to forward those to you. and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker for today. Our second speaker is Mr. Curtis Dubay. He's a senior economist in the Economic Policy Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He tracks the condition of the economy and analyzes the impact of public policy and economic growth and runs the Chamber's Chief Economist Committee. Let's all welcome Curtis. Curtis, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to give an overview of the national economy. I think it will fit in well with the rundown we've had of Iowa, and I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to that point. So from a very high level, and this hasn't changed now for 10 going on 11 months, is that the virus is really what's controlling the economy. As the virus goes, so too does the economy, and that hasn't changed, and that's not going to change anytime soon. What we've seen very clearly is that when the virus levels spike, we get a drop in economic activity, and that has shown up really clearly in the last few months, really the last couple of weeks. So the economy was doing very well in say October and into November, but then virus levels started to spike, and since then we've seen a real pullback in the economic data. So for instance, in December we lost 140,000 jobs. That was the first monthly loss of jobs since April. We had been growing a very steady clip after a huge loss of jobs in March and April of 2020, but we lost that momentum in December when we lost that 140,000 jobs. Most of those jobs were lost in the service. All the jobs actually were lost in the service sector. We added jobs in goods producing and manufacturing. We lost all jobs and services and heavily concentrated in restaurants and bars. And that's because as virus levels surge, two things happen. People are less willing to go out and engage in economic activity, and we did have government-imposed shutdowns of restaurants and bars, and that results in layoffs. But the service sector in general has been hit very hard by the pandemic. We do have this, what's referred to as the K-shaped recovery. So we have lots of businesses are doing very well, especially on the manufacturing and goods producing side. We've had a strong recovery. Lots of people buying goods and services, like we heard earlier. I mean, buying goods. Services, not so much. Services are at the bottom part of the K. But even there, some services are doing well. For instance, finance and real estate. Real estate's doing very well. But when it comes to bars and restaurants, travel, tourism, events, whether it's sporting or theatrical events or professional events, events that we would have been in person in normal times, all those things are really struggling, and they're at the bottom of the K. So that's where the job losses were located. So we saw that pullback in jobs in December. We've gotten unemployment claims the last couple of weeks. For last week, that came out earlier today, there were 900,000 initial unemployment claims. Clearly, that's much too high. We had been trending down closer to 700,000. We've kicked back up closer to 1 million now. It was 936,000 the week before. So a lot of people claiming unemployment insurance in the last few weeks. The trick is that, or the catch is that the latest relief package that was passed at the very end of December has increased unemployment benefits. So there's an extra incentive now to file those claims. So that's wrapped up in there, but no matter how you slice it, too many people filing for unemployment. It's a bad sign. We could see another negative month in jobs for January when we get that in the first week of February. Retail sales also fell in December. They fell in actually October, November, and December. There's a clear slowing in retail sales. Now, the good news though is that retail sales are still above their pre-pandemic level. They had a V-shaped recovery. They fell very steeply in March and April, and they bounced back. They were above their pre-pandemic high as of June, and they've remained above that. They're still above that. Retail sales in 2020 were above where they were in 2019, but on a month-to-month basis, they've fallen in the last 3 months, and that's concerning from an overall perspective. But again, it's the virus driving. The virus really drives what goes on in the economy. And the fourth indicator that the economy has been slowing in the last few weeks is consumer sentiment. That came out a couple of days ago, and it showed preliminary for January. We'll get the final numbers next week, but preliminary consumer sentiment for January declined as virus levels surged. So we have an indication that the economy is slowing right now. But from the standpoint of the entirety of 2021, I'm very bullish. I think we're looking at in a year that will see economic growth exceed 6% likely. And that's because we're going to get past the virus at some point soon, I hope. With vaccines and effective therapeutics out there, we hope to see the virus numbers come down and return to more normal activity. So those things I was pointing out, we can do more of them. We can go out to bars and restaurants. We can go to events, hopefully. My wife and I have a bet. We have, for her birthday last year, which is in February, so this is last birthday, I bought tickets to a concert in DC that was supposed to be at our arena where the Caps and Wizards play. And it got canceled. I think it was supposed to be in September. It was June. It was June of 2020. It got pushed to September of 2021. So we have a bet going whether that will actually happen in DC in 8 months. 8 months from today, actually, I think it is. So we'll see. But fingers crossed that we can go back to more of those activities once the vaccines get more widely distributed and those therapeutics are more available than they are right now. So if that happens, there's a tremendous upside for the economy, and that's because those industries I indicated are waiting to recover. They want to get back to work. They want to get back to serving people, and people want to get back to buying and experiencing those services and those things. So there's pent up demand, and there's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines. So we have another round of relief coming from the federal government, $600 per person for, I forget the income threshold, but $600 checks going out. Additional checks may be coming from the Biden administration that are from Congress because the Biden administration is pushing it. So another $1,400 checks could be going out to plus that up to $2,000 checks. Unemployment benefits, like I indicated, are now plussed up again at the federal level. So there's a lot of money out there that people will have to spend. And so you add the money with the pent up demand and getting past the virus, and you could see a really strong recovery in the second half of this year. The other aspect of that is that savings have been extremely high. Personal income is actually higher today than it was before the pandemic, which is crazy if you think about it, because we had an enormously painful economic event. And usually incomes are going to fall because people are out of work and everything that happens to the recession. But incomes are now higher than they were prior to the pandemic, and that's because of that government relief that's gone out, the original round of checks, the original increase in unemployment benefits have put money in people's pockets, and a lot of people have remained at work, and then a lot of people have gone back to work too. So that has kept incomes afloat and actually above where they were prior to the pandemic. And the economy was in good shape back then. So that is really saying a whole lot, that incomes are still remain higher than they were prior to the pandemic. So that's really good news. And I think there's the other side of that is that savings are exceedingly high. So savings they were at one point in the middle of the pandemic, they were like 5 or 6 times higher than they were in a normal month. Now they're still elevated. They've come down a whole lot as we had a little bit more normalizing, but savings still remains well above what it normally is. And that means that people have money in their savings accounts and their checking accounts that they're ready to spend when we can get back more to normal. So I am bullish on the future of the economy, especially for the rest of this year. But in the interim, again, the virus really is what is in control, and until we can get fully past it, we are likely to see a bumpy road, like I pointed out. And hopefully we see cases. There's some indications cases are plateauing and they'll come down. If that's the case, we'll see a rise of economic activity in the interim. But again, if they spike again, then you're likely to see us go right back into where we've been. And this has been this has been a cycle now going back 10 months, that when the virus levels rise, the economy drops, and vice versa. So the next round of stimulus will certainly be helpful to the rebound that we hopefully get in the second half of the year. Other parts of the Biden agenda might not be so helpful on the economic front. So if you've seen the proposal that they put out last week, and I assume they're going to request is put into some kind of legislative package. They want things like a $15 minimum wage. That's not going to help the economy recover. That would do the opposite. Luckily, I don't think there's going to be a lot of maneuverability or a lot of chance for a large economic legislative agenda. There just aren't the margins in either side of Congress, either the House or the Senate, to get big things like that done. So I think that there's a much greater likelihood of a Biden administration doing a lot of stuff on the administrative side, much like happened at the tail end of the Obama administration, doing a lot of things through the regulatory agencies and through the rulemaking process. I would definitely keep an eye on the financial body, so things like rules from the SEC, the Consumer Financial Protection Board, Treasury, FDIC, OCC, any place where they can do things on the financial regulatory front, they're probably going to do. Department of Labor is likely to be active as well. And so those things that we'll all be keeping an eye on because it does impact business activity. On the upside, though, I do think there'll be a better, more thoughtful approach when it comes to trade. I don't think we'll see kind of the trade policy on a whim that we saw during the Trump administration. I do think trade policy has fundamentally changed, though, from where it was, say, in 2016. There's a lot more heavy skepticism about free trade in both parties than there was prior to President Trump's administration. So I think we're not going to go all the way back to where we were, but I think there's going to be a more thoughtful approach, a more systematic approach, rather than firing off tweets or whatever it is to shift trade policy. Remember, there were warring factions within the Trump administration trying to be the ones who actually set trade policy. That's not going to happen in the Biden administration. It will be more coherent and easier to follow. But I think that they have no choice but to remain tough on China, whatever that means, however they define that. But politically, I don't think there's any administration can now be seen as being soft on China. Again, whatever that means, I'm not really sure. But that's kind of the domestic political reality. I could go on for a while. I hit on a lot of different topics, but I think I'll stop there. If you have questions about anything I touched on, happy to answer those. If you have questions about anything I didn't get to, please let me know. Happy to answer those as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Curtis. We will have everyone continue to put questions in the chat box, but we will jump to our next presenter and we will get to the questions after Dave speaks. So I will turn it over to Molly.
Thank you so much, Curtis. We appreciate you being with us today. And our final speaker today, we are pleased to introduce Mr. Dave Swenson. He is a research scientist in the Department of Economics at Iowa State University and a lecturer in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Iowa. Reminder that the bios for all of our speakers today are in the link in the chat feature and also on the Chamber website. It is my pleasure to introduce our final speaker today for our 2021 Forecast Luncheon, Mr. Dave Swenson. Dave.
Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for the introductions. For you folks who don't know who I am or what I do, I work at Iowa State University, and I'm going to try here to open this up. Start my slides, and I'll just ask, are you seeing these now?
Not yet, Dave.
Okay, we'll see if it's starting up yet here.
Now we are. Looks like we're at the end.
Very, very good. I'm going to go stop. I'm going to start all over again and go to F5. Okay, I'm Dave Swenson, work at Iowa State University. I'm a community and regional economist. The job that I've been doing over the last 30 years at Iowa State University has been to study Iowa's economy, specifically a little bit the regional economy, and especially the rural economy. So that's my emphasis when I talk about what's going on in Iowa. I know what's going on with the big picture nationally. I know what's going on in the Midwest, but mostly I try to know what's going on in Iowa. So what I'm going to talk about today is the things that I see affecting the Dubuque and Dubuque County economies over the next several months. Now, a lot of it's going to be a repeat of what we've just heard, but not that much of it, but it's going to be a little bit of overlap, and I think we're going to reinforce one another as I move along. Now, the way I want to structure this, and in the time that I have to talk, a little bit about the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic economies, a quick look at the national situation, but then I want to zero in on Iowa's situation, Iowa's characteristics. And then towards the end, then I'll get a little bit of a more detailed look at Dubuque and Dubuque County to give us a sense of how you've been performing. As we move through this, I'm interested in these questions. What does recovery look like? And are we able to see what our recovery is going to look like from some of the information that I present? Or are we going to see that you know, we have some things that might hinder our recovery as well. What's our situation being a metropolitan area versus other places that are non-metropolitan? We all have different dynamics that feed into the likelihood of recovery. And then, of course, if we have time, of course, we'll have questions at the end. Now, I'm going to start out right now with this graph. And by the way, folks, Fred is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. And many years ago, I made all these graphs myself, but now I can use their tool to make my graphs. So that's who Fred is. These are jobs. And the US added jobs at just nothing but a consistent rate all the way through right to the brink of that pandemic drop off. Continued improvement in the economy as measured by jobs, harsh and sharp reduction through April of this year, of last year, and then May, June, July, August, we bounced back. Now, everybody talked about there being a V recovery. Well, we're not going to have a V recovery because we're flattening out at the pace of recovery. But for the time being, we've basically recovered close to half of what we lost. Now, but we've lost a lot. Employment right now is something like what it was prior to 2016. So we have a lot of room left to make up in terms of re-employing the public. Now, we just got done hearing about consumption and consumption spending and pent-up demand. You can see that the decline in real personal consumption spending in the United States was harsh as well, all the way through April, but then it bounced back really well into May, June, July, August, September, October. It just tailed off just recently. All of that bounce back was driven by PPP loans, by CARES funding, by a whole range of boosts that were pumped into the economy to sustain consumption during this period and to sustain households that had lost their jobs. And you can see that the recovery in consumption was relatively strong. When we think about lost jobs, though, we also are paying attention to what's going on with labor force participation. And here what we're looking at are people 25 to 54 years of age. And prior to the pandemic drop-off, we had continued improvement. Even though the labor force in the United States was tightening and unemployment was going down to really much lower levels than we'd enjoyed historically, we had a continued rise. We were drawing people into the labor force, and we had room to grow to even to pre-Great Recession levels of labor force participation. That dropped off sharply, and even though employment has recovered, you can see that all of a sudden, these last several months, that prime group labor force participation has started to go down. And what that means, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more in a little bit, is that we have people leaving the labor force, and that's a worrisome sign. And we're going to pay attention to that as we work our way through our recovery over the next several months. This is what I call, and what other people call, the very scary graph. This is the percentage reduction in employment from the beginning of all of the post-World War II recessions. You can see them right here. And we don't really care about most of these, but this was the Great Recession. And Dr. Kuehl talked about this. And it basically took us quite a lot of months, around 76 months, before we clawed back all the jobs that we had lost. This is what's happening right now. And we recovered quite strongly, but now we've tailed off. And the big issue is, how long is it going to take us to get back up to this zero mark? And how long it takes us to get to that zero mark, as we just heard from Curtis Dubay, is a function of how well the workforce is, how able we are to interact socially. That's going to be the key thing. And so how rapidly does the pandemic end is really the issue that we're going to be looking at with regard to how long this recession consequences last here in the United States. And we're waiting for it to go. So where were we? We had pre-pandemic in the United States, we had wonderful historic sustained growth, lowest recorded unemployment, strong participation rates that had continued to grow and signaled the capacity for continued growth. Things were looking good. We had low inflation and low borrowing costs, so we didn't have things heating up the economy that would worry people. We did have real inflation adjusted, that's what real means, wage growth. Now, of course, there were exceptions. People at the upper end were enjoying relatively good growth. Certain categories of middle wage workers were enjoying good growth, but many lower wage workers were not. And so there was a gap in terms of who was realizing growth and who wasn't. But on average, we had real wage growth. Now, we had problems in the ag sector. Those were driven by a variety of things. First of all, agriculture is really good at producing so much commodity that it drives down prices. That's just a factor. It was made worse with the trade wars. And the trade wars, the antagonisms, not just with China, but with our neighbors to the north, to the south, and across the pond over into Europe, those all had an impact on manufacturing's ability in the United States to compete and to produce product and to profit. And thrive. So that was towards the latter part of that decade. These erratic, I'm going to use my words, and unproductive trade policies, we still had growth nonetheless, and that growth was relatively strong. Post-pandemic, as I just showed you, we've erased many of those jobs. We've recovered a little more than half. It's better in some states and worse in others. We had for a very short period of time the highest post-depression unemployment rate. That doesn't really matter so much because we bounced back so fast, but it does tell us how badly an economy can be damaged by an unforeseen event. We had strong structural damage to the economy. Now, we hope a lot of this comes back, but I suspect we're going to lose a lot of economic activity in these areas that were hit the hardest, like leisure, entertainment, travel. Those industries are many of them are going to go bankrupt, or they're going to shrink, or they're not going to be what they were before, or they're going to take a long time before people really re-engage those service activities like they did in the past. And then entrepreneurship. And when I say entrepreneurship, it is my sense that we're going to start seeing quite a lot of business failures, especially small business failures, that's going to have to work its way out. There will be new entrepreneurship as we get into recovery, but we can count our pluses on that side, but we can't lose sight of the negatives and how much gets lost. Again, we already know this, unprecedented public spending. This in and of itself is very important, and you can argue whether there's been enough or not, but the fact of the matter is this demonstrated how important it is for the government to be involved with managing a disaster of this magnitude. And then, of course, we've had strong shifts in consumer preferences and, of course, erosions in consumer confidence. But strong shift in consumer preferences, as was just described, people are buying different things than they used to buy, or they're not buying things that they want to buy, but they can't buy. And so we do have those issues right now that we're dealing with. This is just a quick picture of the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment graph. Here, consumer sentiment was at this index of around 100 for quite a long time, 2 years, 2.5 years, and then dropped off sharply during the pandemic and really hasn't recovered anywhere near where consumer spending recovered, hasn't recovered anywhere near where employment has recovered. Let's see if I can, there we go. What about Iowa? Well, Iowa is different than the United States, and Dr. Kuehl talked about it being somewhat of a laboratory. I don't know if it's as much of a laboratory as perhaps he thinks it is, but it is unique in many ways, and it is much like the national economy in other kinds of ways. First of all, during the these are indexed right at the beginning of 2008, so we're just looking at employment change. You can see that during the Great Recession, Iowa didn't decline as much as the nation did. It recovered more rapidly. We had recovered all of our lost jobs by April of 2013. The US did not recover all of its lost jobs until April of 2014. Iowa continued to recover, but it didn't recover anywhere near the pace of recovery that the nation went through. And of course, we both went through our pandemic dip and then partial recovery. But the point I want to show you, though, here in Iowa is how stagnant Iowa's economy in terms of job growth has been over the past 2 years. In fact, it was quite worrisome prior to the pandemic. It was something I both wrote about and talked about quite a lot. Of what's going on with our economy, where it's growing, where it's not growing, and what are the consequences of that. But the point to be made here is that Iowa was distinct from the nation, where the economy of the nation was growing robustly right up to the point of the pandemic. Iowa's economy basically was just limping along in the aggregate. In fact, Iowa grew more slowly than all of its neighboring states this last decade. And here you've got these numbers. I'm starting at the beginning of the decade. This is Iowa. We've already seen what Iowa looks like. And these are the surrounding states. Illinois, to the east of you all, outgrew us, especially in the last half of this decade. Minnesota, very much outgrew Iowa. Missouri started out slow but caught up. Nebraska to the west, again, just about the same pace as everybody else, but a little bit higher than Iowa. South Dakota, where I'm from, all of them are dipping, of course, but did better than Iowa, even Wisconsin. And so, you know, Iowa's, the point I'm trying to make is Iowa's economy isn't growing that much, but if you look at the last half of our neighbors and excluding Minnesota, neither have our neighbors. We haven't been doing that well here in the mid part of the United States. And this is the measure of the pandemic consequences. This is the change from April, from February. We can see Iowa dipped at 12%. The highest was 16%. The lowest was South Dakota and Nebraska at 9%. So we're kind of right in the middle. Same thing with our change from April to November. It's the last time I have any numbers. And you can see Iowa at 8%, that 8% jobs recovery. The highest was Wisconsin at 10, the lowest was Nebraska at 6. So again, we're right in the middle. We don't stand out significantly better. We don't stand out significantly worse. We're just simply right in the middle with regard to our recovery. But you know, a few weeks ago, we had this headline, Iowa's unemployment rate dropped slightly to 3.6% in November. And, you know, that's just 1 percentage point higher than it was a year ago. And if you looked at that number, you would say Iowa's economy is really running on all cylinders. But that's not what's going on right now. If you look at the last set of numbers, here's what we know. We know that the number of unemployed Iowans declined by 130,100 persons, according to the household survey. The number of employed Iowans over that period of time has grown by just 37,000. And so what that means is 72% of the reduction in the number of unemployed Iowans, over 93,000, has come from people leaving the labor force. Now, this is a big issue here in Iowa. We suspect from national numbers that the largest fraction of those people leaving the labor force are women. They are leaving the labor force because they have childcare responsibilities and that there's been disruptions in their childcare services in their area. Others might be having to stay at home because of children's educational needs. Those responsibilities more often fall to the mother, more so than the father. And we have this issue in the nation. We wonder how much that is an issue here in Iowa. But what we do know is that this pattern of labor force contraction is distinct from the national pattern. And I'm going to show you this here in just a second. Over here on the left are the jobs. This is payroll employment. This is the jobs. And you can see how we recovered more than half of those losses. Over here on the right is the labor force. And even though the jobs started recovering in May, our labor force continued to decline. So this right now is an issue that I want to pay attention to. I'm hoping that newer numbers will show us that it isn't quite as severe as it looks right now, but that's one of the big issues I think that's confronting Iowa in terms of its recovery. Will we be able to entice those people who left the labor force back into the labor force? And will that be enough to fuel enough economic growth to recover all of the jobs that we've lost during this early part of this pandemic? Here's just Iowa. Again, I'm indexing them right here to beginning in November of 2019. I'm comparing the United States with Iowa, and you can see here's the US. It contracted, and then starting in May, the labor force recovered some and then leveled off. Here's Iowa's labor force. It continued to decline. So pre-pandemic, Iowa was slow to no growth, although we had an enviable unemployment rate. I haven't talked about it here in this presentation, but there were substantial differences in economic performance between metro and non-metropolitan economies. Iowa's non-metropolitan economies had not recovered by the end of 2019 the level of jobs they had prior to the Great Recession. So the net of all growth that was going on in the state of Iowa was being driven by growth in the metropolitan areas. Our ag sector was damaged significantly, but it's also been boosted in recent years by significant federal payments. First, you had the payments that are market facilitation payments that were as a result of the trade action. And then, of course, we had additional payments as a consequence of the pandemic. You heard, you showed the graph before about the increase in bankruptcies in agriculture. I'm going to counter that is not a big issue. The 27 bankruptcies that were reported represents 0.04% of all farm proprietorships in Iowa. To take that number and infer that farmers are in a situation, something akin to the kind of disaster we witnessed in the 1980s, is not correct. And as a matter of fact, real farm income from all sources in the last quarter of 2020, last two quarters of 2020 had grown to a level that was higher than the decade average. And so farmers had their boom in the early part of the decade, they had their bust, they had somewhat of a recovery fueled by government payments, and the farm economy isn't in as dire shape, I believe, as many people thought it was. Iowa manufacturing had recovered to the level it was prior to the Great Recession. Most of that recovery was showing up in non-durable goods production, primarily food. Of course, post-pandemic, we lost jobs, widespread unemployment. Some industries did not lose as many jobs as others. Agriculture in and of itself is really not pandemic affected in terms of employment losses. Also, rural counties, by the nature of their economic dependencies, both in terms of agriculture as well as significantly high number of people are employed also in manufacturing, especially non-durable goods manufacturing and food manufacturing. In the aggregate, those counties look a little bit better than the metropolitan counties. It's Iowa's mid-sized counties, the counties like Clinton and Cerro Gordo and Fort Dodge and Webster County and Ottumwa and Wapello. Those counties have performed the worst, and they're the ones that are not doing as well. All righty. This is where we've lost the jobs on a year-over-year basis. Where are we standing at the end of November 20 compared to November 2019? Leisure and hospitality jobs, that's dining, drinking, hotels, motels, entertainment, all of those kinds of jobs. If your economy depended significantly on those jobs, you're feeling these losses. Education and health services, most of that is in health services. By the way, that's private education services. So most of that is in health services. 11% of the losses that we're still living with are in government, and all of that is in local government, schools and in cities and counties. None of it is in the state on the aggregate or the federal government. Professional and business services, the construction sector explains 7% of that reduction, total reduction in jobs. It's 82,000 fewer jobs than we had a year ago, by the way. That's what these percentages are relating to. Trade, transportation, and utilities, some of that is in retail. Hardly any of that is in utilities, and some of that is in transportation. All the remainder of personal services, manufacturing, just 6%, and financial activities is negligible. So you can see which sectors are bouncing back or not, weren't hurt the most. And I'm just going to go skip this slide because that's basically telling us what we just saw. So for the state of Iowa, there will be no full recovery until the pandemic is brought under control. We have categories that we might want to pay attention to. Issues associated with housing and commercial rent and or mortgage issues. Business failures are going to rise considerably. We may lose 20–30%, for example, of our dining and drinking establishments in the state of Iowa. That's a possibility. I believe the more diversified urban economies are going to recover substantially, even though they also were hit hardest in terms of leisure and entertainment and recreation economic losses. Iowa has stability advantages in ag and non-durable manufacturing, and that absence of tourism-related industries as a statewide emphasis. And that in and of itself is a stabilizing factor to the state, given what's happened with regard to the pandemic. But the rest of the economy is going to recover like the nation's economy recovers. And so we don't have anything really that special in Iowa that's pandemic proof beyond agriculture and manufacturing that is going to lead the way. I'm going to take a quick look here at the Dubuque economy. This is the Dubuque Metro, and I'm going to compare your growth over the last, I think I indexed these at from 2011 on, and I'm going to compare your growth to all of the other metropolitans in the state. First of all, here's the state of Iowa's recovery that I've already talked about, and then its dip during the pandemic. Here's where I live right now, Ames. You can see we had a heck of a dip when we went into that pandemic, but had recovered close to levels we were prior to the pandemic. So we stand out a little bit distinctly. Cedar Rapids, their economy has actually performed worse than the state average over the course of this decade. Des Moines is the strongest economy in the state of Iowa, and you can see how they both grew and then the degree to which they declined and recovered. Here's Dubuque. You're just a little above the state average towards the last part of the decade, but you did have noticeably a very, very strong decline, and I'll show that in the next graph. Iowa City, to perhaps many of your all's surprise, has been actually kind of losing ground over the last couple of years and continues to lose ground even after it had its initial recovery. Here's Sioux City, slower than the state average, and then last is Waterloo, very distinct and performing much worse than the rest of the metros. Where does your city sit, where your metropolitan area sit in terms of decline from April from February? You had the most decline in terms of jobs, and then your recovery from April to this last November was 13%. The state of Iowa was at 12%. You were significantly worse in decline, but significantly better in terms of your bounce back recovery. If we look at the last column, perhaps it's more important to look at that. Where are we on a year-over-year basis? And on a year-over-year basis, you know, the state is down about 5% in terms of jobs. Dubuque is really, really close to that. Some of the counties are in better shape, like Ames and Sioux City on a comparative basis. Dubuque and Cedar Rapids are down about 6%, but not that far off of the state average. This is the composition of job losses. It's a very much more condensed categories that I can use when I talk about the metropolitans as compared to the states when I did this before. Your goods producing jobs on a year-over-year basis, 11% of them are in goods producing. That's mostly construction and manufacturing in your region. Private sector producing, that private sector service producing, that is just all of the non-retail services that are in your economy, ranging from healthcare to business services to personal services, to accountants, to engineers and architects, all of those kinds of categories. That explains, and it's also the leisure, dining, drinking, leisure and entertainment. that explains 3/4 of your job losses here over on a year-over-year basis. Retail, I pulled it out specifically, about 9%, even though nationally retail sales have recovered quite well, we still have a loss in retail jobs. And then government, and again, that's primarily local government, city, school, and county. These numbers come from their annual retail sales report. It's just to give you an idea of how you're performing as a city and as a county compared to your peers. Now these bars, these are taxable, real taxable sales for your area. And so this is of your peer group, this is the 25% and the 75% range. And you can see that you're very close to that 75% range compared to all of the metropolitan cities that were in this study. And then your county numbers, though, are at the bottom. And that's the average for the county. So Dubuque as a city in and of itself, and then the county-wide numbers, you can see you're more towards the 25%. You can see that your sales, real per capita sales, have been relatively flat, but there's nothing alarming in any of these numbers. Where does that make you stand? Well, for among the cities, you're ranked 7 out of 21 in your peer group. So you're in the upper third of the metropolitan cities in terms of your taxable sales performance. Among the counties, though, the metropolitan counties, you're 7th out of 10. So that puts you down towards the bottom third in terms of overall performance. Last, I think it's last here, I want to look at your labor supply because I kept talking about the labor supply issue. Here's your labor supply. Over time, relatively flat going into the pandemic and then dropping sharply. Here's what's going on at the state level. I see no difference between your economy with regard to labor supply and the state's economy with regard to labor supply. That is a big issue. That is something we're going to have to work our way through. So Iowa's economy had been stagnant prior to the pandemic recession. Are we going to recover and still have a stagnant economy? I don't know. Do we have things that we can be optimistic about? I'm yet to see them emerge right now with regard to something going on in Iowa that's special. We've only recovered slightly better than the national average, and we're about average with our neighbors. The decline in the labor supply still alarms me. It should alarm you. I believe that that will create a lag in recovery. And if we don't offset that lag, I don't see any other mechanism to drive growth in the state of Iowa. You have the same labor supply issue as the state does, but as a metro economy and a higher level of diversification than the state average, I think the likelihood of metropolitan economies attracting new workers and recovering is much stronger than the state as a whole. And I am going to stop right there. And if you are interested in these slides, you're welcome to contact me, and I can take questions along with Curtis Dubay here if there's any time left.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much. Dave, actually, the first question is for you from Bob Woodward with TH Media. What do you foresee for travel and tourism in Iowa and Dubuque? And I know you've touched on it a little bit, but I guess just a broader explanation.
Sure. Well, okay, travel and tourism, well, first of all, we have pent up demand for recreation activity and outdoor recreation activity and safe recreation activity. The degree to which, though, the average person is going to engage in that recovery of that sector really is going to be a function of how safe we feel engaging in those activities. Statewide, that is not a big fraction of our economy, but in areas like Dubuque and along the Mississippi River, it is an important part of the economy. I believe it's going to lag other recovering sectors. Short answer.
Okay. Do we have any other audience questions? And if it's an in-depth one, I can't unmute you if you want to ask it yourself. You just need to type in the chat. while we're waiting, I just want to thank both of you so much for being on. That's a lot of information. Dave, I know you said something about getting the slides. I actually have the other two presenters, so we can get your slides up on our website. So anyone who wants to view this can, and this will also be made live, this link, hopefully by tomorrow. So thank you again, both of you.
And I shared some slides. It's a whole slide deck. Please distribute it. You're welcome to use it. If you have questions, please be in touch.
Awesome, wonderful. Just a comment from Ben Graham with Graham Style Store. There's a ton of pent-up demand in the wedding industry.
That is very true. I said events, right? So I mean, that definitely counts. That's a good one. I'm going to add that. That's really quite interesting to the list. But that's certainly true. Just events and parties in general. But I thought about this because like the last thing I did before the pandemic was I was in Florida and I did a couple events like these, conferences in Orlando, and then we had our board meeting down in West Palm Beach. And then I was thinking about all the people that are employed to staff those events at the various venues. It's a lot of people, and those places are booked hour after hour, day after day, and they can't operate. And weddings is a good one that I'll definitely add to the mix. The other very interesting that we've been tracking the job loss by industry. The motion picture industry has lost by far the biggest percentage of its workforce. It's over 50% the last time I checked. So they're still not operating anywhere near normal. They're still not operating anywhere near normal.
All right, it doesn't look like anything else came in, so I will turn it over to Molly.
Thank you, Justine. I'd like to take this time to thank all three of our speakers. The time and the research and your expertise was so appreciated today. Chamber members, we will have these slides to share with you if you'd like to view them more. If you have questions, please let us know. I do want to take this time again to thank our sponsors. Their support helps make these events possible. Once again, Medical Associates Clinic and Health Plans. We have Midwest One, Q Casino, and TH Media. A virtual round of applause for our sponsors and our speakers and presenters today. Thank you one and all. Stay safe, be well. I did hear positive news that from our speakers that coming out of the pandemic, that there is growth expected, hope on the horizon, cautiously optimistic. Here's to a great 2021. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.